of the term organizational learning in a business context. Shell looked at this data, the vast majority of businesses which don't adapt very well, and this small number which seem to be quite good at adapting, and said, obviously, there's a big difference in the capacity to learn, to adapt and change as the world around you changes. That was the first use of the term organizational learning in the business world. Now, there had been some academics who had used the term prior, but their work wasn't that well known. But within a few years of that Shell study, you saw CEOs around the world talking about learning. You heard people like Jack Welch, who was without doubt the most frequently quoted CEO in the Western world for a long time, the General Electric CEO, saying things like the rate at which an organization learns will determine its competitive advantage. He used to love to say, when the world outside you changes faster than you change, you're in difficulty. So all of a sudden this idea started to get into the mainstream. Interestingly, it never really got into the mainstream of the universities, which is not unusual. A lot of times the business world is ahead of the university world in really understanding significant new ideas. And there's two aspects that came out in the Shell study. And now give me a chance to go back and say what I was saying again, just a little differently. First off, you might say the internal. Those organizations that seem to have this ability to adapt and evolve had certain qualities or characteristics of their culture, their way of managing. What starts to make learning an organizational phenomenon, not just an individual, but an organizational phenomenon, is how we manage. Organizations that are very tight in their desire to control, manage in a highly controlling way, tend to kill their capacity to learn and adapt. Because what they saw when they traced the history, and they studied, of course, many of those they called them the long-lived companies. When they studied them, they found out something that's kind of obvious in retrospect. The company's businesses changed a lot. DuPont was one of the only two U.S. companies in that cohort of long-lived companies. Obviously, the U.S. is a relatively young society, so it had only two companies. DuPont was one. DuPont was originally in the gunpowder business. That was its core founding business. Needless to say, they haven't been in the gunpowder business for a very long time. So you found when you traced these companies that their business focus changed a lot. But how that happened was the really important question. What was it about the way they managed and led the enterprise? Because what they found, the pattern again and again, was that while the mainstream part of the company could be focused, let's say, on a core business, it wasn't like one day the executives woke up and said, the gunpowder business is not the future, we're going to change to this. That's not the way it happened. What they found was the companies that were really good in this adaptation, dynamics, were capable of allowing what they called experiments in the margin. They were open to people pursuing new businesses and new business ideas, many of which, of course, will fail. By definition, they're new. Some of which turn out to be the seeds of the future of the business. So businesses or management systems that are too tight, too much trying to control everything, do not allow the seeds to be explored of the new. So this capacity to both be focused on your core and tolerant, which is the word the Shell study eventually used, to have a culture of tolerance for experiments in the margin, turns out to be crucial to be generating the future businesses simultaneously with focusing on your core business. So they found that the companies that were adaptive had a system of management that was highly open and tolerant. They couldn't be too tight in trying to control, or they would never generate the seeds of the new while they were simultaneously focused on what they do today. The second major feature of the organizations that were long-lived relates back to what I was saying at the beginning. And this language, what I'll share with you right now, was in the report in 1982. Again, it wasn't shared publicly for another 15 years. And there was finally a book published in 1997 by the Harvard Business School Press called The Living Company. That was the title of the book, and I can show you the name of the author in just a minute. The second feature of the companies was what they called sensitivity to the environment. 1982. They concluded the long-lived companies had a much higher level of sensitivity to their environment. Now, I just telling you that because this was way before language like corporate social responsibility and all these jargon terms today even existed. This was simply their desire or their effort to try to make sense of these companies and why they adapted. They seem to have a sense, this is the language that Shell used, and a high priority on what the health of their communities, the health of the world they lived in, because it kept them in touch with the larger world. A high level of sensitivity to their environment. If you think about it, it's perfectly logical. If you're going to have an organization that lives for 200 years, the world around you is going to change a lot. How perceptive are you? How much are you paying attention? How open are your mental models to those changes? It doesn't mean that everybody agrees, again. It doesn't mean that all of a sudden you get aha, this world is ending, a new world is starting. No, it's a much more organic process. But you must pay attention. You must be paying attention to what new is emerging around you. In a sense, is very obvious, but very unusual. Keep in mind, 18 companies are what they found over the last 200 years. By the way, several of them were in Asia, of course, a lot of them in Europe. That list was about, as I say, 2 American companies. The other long-lived American company that they studied was Procter & Gamble, which has also been in existence for 200 years, DuPont and Procter & Gamble. Then there were about a dozen European and about a half a dozen Asian companies. So they were all around the world. And they found these common features. So when I started off by just sharing with you some of my own perspectives from traveling around the world, that we are in the midst of profound changes right now in the world. The past will not look like the future. The path of the development for the last 50 to 150 years, different places in the world, is now already being interrupted. It will not continue. You may or may not agree with me. I'm not assuming you agree with me. I'm just obviously sharing my point of view. But I am telling you one of the foundations of the organizational learning movement. Those organizations which are highly sensitive to their environment adapt better. If in concert, they create this openness internally. So again, there's 2 aspects. There's this sensitivity to the environment, and there's this management culture of openness and tolerance. You need them both. You could have brilliant technical people doing wonderful scenarios about the future, but you manage in a way that's very rigid and tight, it won't penetrate. It won't create space in the organization. Or alternatively, you have a lot of openness and tolerance internally, but you're really very closed in terms of thinking about the larger world. You also won't create it. These are the roots of the organizational learning movement. And I just want to underscore, as I finish these opening comments, all of this is rooted in trying to understand the practical challenges of sustaining a successful enterprise over a long period of time. None of what I just told you are academic studies. They're studies originally done by a corporation, Shell, but the work, in my experience, has been steadily advanced by people very much like the people here in this room. Practical people trying to assure that they can help build an enterprise that will be successful and vibrant and innovative over an extended period of time. So, let me pause here all I wanted to do in this opening was kind of lay out some of the basic ideas. I want to give you a couple minutes. Today will be a little bit different. One of the reasons we've everybody seated at the tables and so on here. Today will be a little bit different because we're going to make an effort to mix throughout the day some ideas that we share from the stage, from the front, with your own reflections. What does this mean to me? What do these ideas mean to my organization? A lot of the people here are from governmental organizations. I really appreciate the desire here in the Emirates to really have innovation deeply embedded in our governmental organizations. Very, very important. And it's a big problem in many parts of the world today, where we have all this innovation going on in business, but no parallel innovation going on in government. And so as a result, the business kind of drifts off and totally loses touch with the needs of the society. I think it's very important to have the innovation embedded in both places. One of the most destructive ideas in the world, in my opinion, that's really taken root in the last really 50 years. It's got worse and worse. The purpose of business is to maximize return on invested capital. That's a crazy idea. I know that sounds crazy for me to say. I mean, like, doesn't everybody know that? I mean, the purpose of business is business, right? Purpose of business is profit. Yes, most people in most societies around, purpose of business is profit. No, no. The purpose of business is its purpose. You must make a profit in order to stay in the game. Peter Drucker used to say it very eloquently. He used to say, profit for a company is like oxygen for a person. If you don't have enough, you're out of the game. But if you think your purpose is breathing, you've missed something. So when we only have innovation in the business sector, but we don't have it in the governmental sector in parallel, we get this disconnect. Business starts to think after a while that its only purpose is to please its investors. But in fact, businesses exist ultimately to serve their societies. They're trying to add value that is valued by somebody. And when you lose that sense of what a business is all about, they drift and they become very self-serving. And we see, of course, so many examples in the world today of businesses who are in crucial industries which have a huge impact on how society functions, that have completely lost their sense of purpose and think their whole purpose is to maximize their profit, which then quickly becomes very selfish and individual. My whole purpose as a member of the business is to make as much money as I can. And then the entire business sector becomes counterproductive. So I really appreciate the fact that in the room here we have people from business and people from government both, because I think only by sustaining a real desire to innovate in both do we keep them well connected. So what I'd like to give you a few minutes to do is just think a little bit. I've tried to suggest that the whole organizational movement has two fundamental roots. One has to do with how we manage and lead, the culture we want to create within an enterprise. And the second has to do with our ability to pay attention to the world in which we operate, to be sensitive to that environment, to sense what's emerging and how real changes might be happening all around us today, even if they're not widely perceived, so that our organizations are able to adapt to a world that's changing. So those are just two simple ideas. They really are the roots of everything we do. I wanted to give you a couple minutes just to think about that. So what we'll do is we'll take about 5 minutes or so, give you a chance to talk a little bit at your tables, give a chance maybe to hear a few of your comments. Then we'll take a break and come back and resume. And I'm going to share with you some of the practices, you know, how people actually do this. And at the same time, as best I can, kind of share from multiple cultural perspectives. Because I do believe this need for fundamental innovation in how we manage and lead is a global need. It's just as important in education as it is in business, as it is in government. How we shape industries of the critical sectors of our societies that will really help our societies become and remain healthy as the world changes. That will really nurture leadership throughout. It ultimately comes down to what you do. What are some of the practices? So much of the rest of today, we're going to be focusing on those practices, including the last part of the day, which will be what we call World Cafe, which is one of the most basic practices we've found extremely helpful around the world. Actually been very popular here in the Arab world. Saudi Aramco does a lot of its big meetings using a World Cafe process, which is what we'll do in the closing hour, hour and a half of today. So we're going to try to kind of balance these big questions. What's the culture we're trying to build in our enterprise? How do we pay attention to the environment? With the very practical on-the-ground questions. What are the practices? What are some of the things we can be doing that really help embed this in an organization, and respectful of the way it has to be embedded differently in every culture? This is a personal and therefore very cultural process. So what I'd like to do is give you a couple of minutes just to kind of begin talking amongst yourselves. So how is this relevant for me, for my organization, for our context? That's the general question. Specifically, what's one thing I heard this morning, either about the whole innovation in culture and management, or how we pay attention to the world around us? Remember, keep in mind those two fundamentals of this movement. What of any of that seems potentially relevant to me and to my organization? All right? And after a few minutes, I say maybe about 5 minutes or so, you can do this, by the way. Most of your tables have 7 or 8 people sitting around the table. You're going to find it's hard to talk across the table, but it gets kind of noisy in here. My suggestion is you just turn 2 or 3 people who are sitting close to each other so you can hear each other well. What might this mean to me and to my organization? What might be a particular question that I've come here with today that will be very helpful for my learning and my context, my organizational context? And if you would just take a few minutes on that question, it can even be just 2 people, it could just be 1 person sitting next to you, or 2 or 3. Again, I think you'll find it much easier to talk in a group of like 3 people than to try to talk around the table with 8 of you, just because it'll be too noisy. Okay? And then we'll come back together in about 5 or 10 minutes. And then we'll chat for a few minutes and we'll take a break. Okay? What might this mean to me and my organization? Thank you. So, just so we can start off with having a good understanding of some of what you were talking about and some of your questions, it's very helpful as we go through the day that we stay grounded in the reality that you bring. So, who would like to just share a few short comments? I would recommend in like a minute or so, pretty short. What's one question or theme that came up in your conversation at your table? And of course, please feel free to make your statements in Arabic or English. It doesn't really matter.
Hello, my name is Omar Kadra from Adico Abu Dhabi Chamber. What we've come across the table is that we see a lot of high control environments in many organizations, and this is sometimes depleting the chances for innovation. The question that we've had is, how do I get my organization to see that they need to change to become a learning organization? And how do I bring my organization to give up the control culture that it has in order to foster organizational learning?
Great, thank you.
From the presentation, hi, I forgot to introduce. My name is Maheen from Al Ansari Exchange. I have a couple of doubts regarding the change. Actually, from the presentations you mentioned about the learning experience that from the change. For example, I understood my organization, and I understood that there is a change needed. So if I want to implement that change, if there is some, the staff, the people, if they are not ready to accept it, what can I do as a new thing? Forget about the training, other than that, if you can.
I had a little trouble hearing. Could you say it again more slowly, just a little?
Sure, no problem. Suppose, I understood my organization, I learned some things, and I got the feedbacks, okay? From the feedbacks from the people, I understood that something has to be implemented. So I implemented it. Now the people are having a difference of opinion. Like, for example, if they are not ready to accept that change. So what else can be done from my side?
So you've implemented something, and now you see some different points of view about that.
Yes.
Okay, I understand. Thank you.
Thank you.
My name is Wael Al-Anqar from Emirates College of Technology. At our table, we were discussing higher education and how higher education is able to change to the new challenges in the world. And we were discussing that higher education is not as fast in adapting to changes. And professors at universities think of what they do is the right thing, and they don't like to be challenged in the way they teach, in the way they and they are, in many times, they think that they are not to be evaluated. They have the full freedom of what they deliver, the exams, the methodologies, and things like that. And while, if higher education is going to lead societies or make the most drastic changes within societies, they are supposed to be the ones who are able to adapt to changes faster than other organizations.
It's an interesting idea. This is a tough one for me because, of course, I live in those same institutions myself. So I'm smiling because I'm listening to you and realizing just how challenging it is. That's good. Let's hear maybe a couple more so we get a feeling for the whole field of questions here.
Good morning, this is Amit. I think all of us have a common theme here, which is how to make our organizations learning organizations. But a couple of important themes which we were discussing. One is communication, which is very important for effective learning in an organization. So how to make communication effective in an organization so that ultimately it can lead to the goal of learning. And secondly, leadership, like who's leading who in an organization. So to try and understand, what does leadership really mean, and how everyone can be a leader in their own roles and ultimately get to the goal of learning. Thank you.
Thank you.
My name is Mohamed El Mizuki from Arab Tech Construction. Now, in construction industry, in companies like big organizations such as Arab Tech and even other competitors of Arab Tech, if you want to change the mentality about training, learning, the approach should be different. How do you do it? Because they tend to still go with the previous mentality, the traditional way.
Right.
And when you try to speak to them, it slightly becomes a bit political as well. How do you deal with them?
Right.
Thank you.
Thank you.
My name is Abdurrahman Tamimi from Abu Dhabi Police.
You can hold a little closer.
Okay. From Abu Dhabi Police. The questions we have are regarding the development or innovation in organizations such as the police, because we are a public organization that is dedicated to the service of the public. Right. We are limited by the services that we can develop or give to people. Mm-hmm. So how can we innovate? How can we become better at what we do? We're not like businesses. Businesses can come up with new products all the time, can come up with new lines of production. But for police, we have, our main job is to keep safety and security of the community and the society. So how can we do that better? What are the ways that we can, develop or implement in our practices that make us better? Because, we have been dedicated to innovation at Abu Dhabi Police. We've been looking forward to improving all the time. We got so many rewards in quality and in those fields related. We improved our services greatly, but we're still trying to improve even more because times are changing. So what do you have for us? What can you suggest for us that we can do to improve? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
My name is Bilal Abursis from National Transport Authority. Is the next step to have an organizational learning framework? I mean, all these practices, which is comprise the organizational learning, will have a framework or an approach in order to implement it in our organization? Is this the next? Is this the next step to have a framework or approach?
Yeah, no, I understand. I understand. It's a great question. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Assalamu alaikum. I'm Mohamed Mukashfi. We have some interesting sayings in the last session when it comes to production line. I wanted to know if we were customized, how we can liberate ourselves. This is the first one. The second one, what will be the next kind of learning other than the production line?
Yeah, the first question, I just had a little trouble hearing part of it. So would you just restate the first question?
If we are a product that we're coming from the systematic learning experience we have in school and universities, how can we get out of this such customization? As for now, if we are a customized product.
The standardized, is that what you said?
Or standardized products that we are as an output of such learning system or such education system.
Okay, the problem I'm having is just some words. I'm missing some words. It's just accents, I think.
You've mentioned that learning or education systems that we have now tend to produce us as a customized products or standardized products.
Standardized product, yeah.
As for now, how can we get out of this such standardization? This is the first one. And the second one is, if it is a production line or a production system, a systematic learning, what is the next new learning thing that we can avoid to get out of the idea of